Okay, so a few more points regarding the MTech and master's thesis. So we know that the goal of research work behind MTech and master's thesis is to take one or two problems that are important, and basically advance. The study should result in an advancement of the understanding of the problem. So that is one aspect of it. And the other one is, of course, one is studying a problem. So one would like to suggest alternative and better solutions to those particular problems here. So that's the overall goal of the thesis that is there here. And of course, at the end of the thesis, one has to write a thesis report. And in general, we've discussed before, the thesis report would have a master's thesis, will have 4 chapters. The first one is the introduction, the second one is a basic concept and methodology, the third one are the results and discussion, and the fourth one is conclusions and future work. And so some discussion, as I said in the beginning, is there at this particular YouTube site that has been shared earlier. So introduction. So introduction has these 3 parts that are there here. So the first part is in the introduction, you describe the problem that is being tackled in the thesis here. And so basically, as we discussed earlier, that you start from a very high level, a very broad view of the subject, and then gradually come down to the problem, the specific problem, the narrow problem that is being addressed in the thesis. So this is the minimum that I've written here. At least write half a page on the problem. For example, the problem could be the measurement of threshold voltage in a field effect transistor, or it could be the problem of integration of organic photodiode with thin film transistor, or it could be the problem of channel and modulation. So any of the problem that is being discussed. So instead of right away in the first line itself talking about the problem, start from a more general view, for example, about flexible electronics, and then maybe the importance of TFT in a flexible electronics, and then the importance of output resistance in a TFT when you're making an amplifier or even an inverter, the importance of the output resistance, and then that brings in the importance of channel and modulation. And then, so after the problem has been defined, I mean, at least the problem has been broadly defined, the next thing is the literature review, where we basically talk about all the past work that is relevant to the problem. And so one discusses the different papers that have addressed this particular problem, the main contribution of the problem, the main limitation of the work of each particular paper. And we expect at least we expect a good literature review, because that indicates your understanding of the problem, and a minimum of 2 pages of literature review should be there. I'm putting this restriction 2 page just to make sure that enough has been written. This is the minimum. In fact, one should, the more you write, the more it reflects your knowledge about that particular topic here. So once the problem has been described, the literature review has been done, and then one comes to the third part, which is the problem statement. So this now one brings a focus. So earlier, for example, one may say that the problem that is being addressed is the channel and modulation. But in here, problem statement, we talk specifically about that particular issue here, that for example, the channel and modulation, in light of all the literature review that has occurred, the channel and modulation parameter, these are the things that are not well understood, and therefore the goal of the thesis is to use, let's say, a simulation framework to investigate that channel and modulation parameter, let's say, in more detail, compare channel and modulation in, let's say, top contact versus bottom contact transistors. So basically one is defining now what is the scope of the thesis, what is it that one will attempt to answer in the thesis. And then the next part is, how is the thesis organized, organization of the thesis, right? So for example, the thesis is organized in 4 chapters. Chapter 1 does this, chapter 2 does this, chapter 3 and chapter 4, basically an outline of the thesis here. So that should be at least a page here, problem statement and organization of the thesis. The next thing is chapter 2, which is the basic concept and methodology. And so here we start off with the basic concept or the key idea on which the thesis is based. Right. So, for example, let's say if one is talking about threshold voltage, the key idea is that let's say the threshold voltage is being measured in this new way, for example, by this new method, for example, right? So that basic idea or key idea on which the thesis is based is talked about. Minimum, let's say 2 pages or so. One talks about with figures and equations and things like that. And the next part of the thesis is describing the methodology in this particular chapter. The methodology that we will use to investigate this key idea, to illustrate this key idea with results here. So one describes the simulation. If one is using simulation, one describes the simulation framework. For example, one may be using Atlas, the equations that are used in Atlas, the models that one is using, and some typical results. For example, a sample result could be shown here. And one also talks about how the results of simulation are validated. We know that we can simulate anything, but the importance of simulation depends on how close the simulation results are to reality, and therefore one should talk about some validation. And if we are using experimental results, then one talks about, for example, how the device was fabricated, how the devices were characterized, and a sample set of results could be included here. So that's chapter 2, basic concept and methodology. And then the next chapter is results and discussion. So this is the chapter where we describe all the important results, simulation or experimental, all the important results are discussed. And the significance also is illustrated. What is the significance of that particular result, okay? So that's the, the main, one of the main parts of the thesis that is there here. And naturally this should form the bulk of your thesis. So I've not put any page restrictions, but it should be substantial. The last chapter is conclusions and future work. So basically what I would like is that you describe in a few words the problem being discussed in the work. Just to remind, so many times people will not read your chapter 3 or chapter 2. Sometimes somebody may just come to chapter 4 and read what the conclusions of the thesis are. So, so in that sense, if you describe in few words the problem being addressed in the work, so that's about a paragraph or so. And then the main thing is describe the important conclusions. So don't describe what you have done. Don't say, oh, I've simulated this and I did this and I did that and all that. No, this is not a catalog of what you have done, but this describes the conclusions that can be drawn from your work. All right. So I expect at least 1 page after you've done a master's thesis for a year or so. At least you should be able to write 1 page of conclusions that can be drawn from your work. And when you write about the conclusions, try to mention also illustrated with concrete numbers here. For example, let's say, if you're talking about temperature coefficient, so you say, well, a temperature coefficient of 10 per minus 2 was measured under certain conditions, or things like that. So quantitative numbers should be given. And it should not be it should be specific in nature. And the other part of conclusions and future work, conclusions, chapter 4 is the future work. And after you've done the thesis for a year, it's at the end of the thesis that you realize also you appreciate the problem a lot more, and you can also talk about the different ways in which you could have perhaps done the work differently, or if you had more time, you could have done those things. So you describe the limitations of the work, of your present work, and how you would have, if you had more time, how you would have addressed them in the future, and other interesting ideas that can be explored here. So we expect at least half a page of future work and 1 page of at least the conclusion, at least one page. It should be more. If you write, if you have more conclusions and if you give thought to it and can describe it, then that's better. So that's the four chapters of the thesis. And we have talked about abstract earlier. See, abstract is nothing but a thesis described in a paragraph. And so it has this element here. There's a problem being addressed, describing the problem. And so note that it's a paragraph. So we are talking about half a page or 3/4 of a page. So the problem being addressed is about 30% of the abstract. The key idea behind the work, that's another, let's say, 30% of the abstract, and the key results. Again, with very specifically written with quantitative results, and so that comprises 40% here. So it's basically, the whole of thesis condensed in one particular paragraph. And so it's a very important part of the thesis. It's the first thing that somebody who opens the thesis may read to find out what this thesis is all about. So spend some time in writing this particular abstract, and make sure that you address all these 3 points that are there. Okay.